Mrs. Thénardier had glanced into the street and perceived Cosette in ecstasy. Cosette fled with her bucket, running as fast as she could. As the Thénardier tavern was in that part of the village which is near the church, Cosette had to go to the spring in the woods near Chelles to draw water. The farther she went, the thicker became the darkness. There was nobody. There was no longer anybody in the street. She ran out of the village. She ran into the woods, seeing nothing, hearing nothing. She did not stop running until she was out of breath, and even then she staggered on. She went right on, desperate. Thus she arrived at the spring. Cosette did not take time to breathe. It was very dark, but she was accustomed to coming to this fountain. She bent down and plunged the bucket in the water. She was for a moment so excited that her strength tripled. When she was thus bent over, she did not notice that the pocket of her apron emptied itself into the spring. The 15-sou piece fell into the water. Cosette neither saw it nor heard it fall. She drew out the bucket almost full and set it on the grass. She grasped the handle with both hands. She could hardly lift the bucket. After resting a few seconds, she started on. Arriving near the old chestnut tree, which she knew, she made a last halt, longer than the others, to get well rested. Then she gathered all her strength, took up the bucket again, and began to walk on courageously. Meanwhile, the poor little despairing thing could not help crying, "Oh, my God, my God." At that moment, she felt all at once the weight of the bucket was gone. A hand, which seemed enormous to her, had just caught the handle and was carrying it easily. She raised her head. A large, dark form, straight and erect, was walking beside her in the gloom. It was a man who had come up behind her, and whom she had not heard. This man, without saying a word, had grasped the handle of the bucket she was carrying. "What is your name?" said the man. "Cosette." "Who is it that has sent you out into the woods after water at this time of the night?" "Madame Thénardier." "What does she do, your Madame Thénardier?" "She is my mistress," said the child. "She keeps the tavern." "The tavern," said the man. "Well, I am going there to lodge tonight. Show me the way." As they drew near the tavern, Cosette timidly touched his arm. "Monsieur." "Yes, my child." "Here we are, close by the house." "Well?" "Will you let me take the bucket now?" "What for?" "Because if Madame sees that anybody brought it for me, she will beat me." The man gave her the bucket. A moment after they were at the door of the chop house. "Madame," said Cosette, trembling, "here is a gentleman who is coming to lodge." "Ah, my brave man, I am very sorry, but I have no room." "Put me where you will," said the man, "in the garret, in the stable. I will pay as if I had a room." 40 sous. 40 sous. Well, in advance. 40 sous, whispered a wagon driver to Mrs. Thénardier, "but it is only 20 sous." "It is 40 sous for him," replied Mrs. Thénardier in the same tone. "I don't lodge poor people for less." "That is true," added the husband softly. "It ruins a house to have this sort of people." Meanwhile, the man, after leaving his stick and bundle on a bench, had seated himself at a table on which Cosette had been quick to place a bottle of wine and a glass. Suddenly, Mrs. Thénardier exclaimed, "Oh, I forgot, the bread." Mrs. Cosette, according to her custom whenever Mrs. Thénardier raised her voice, sprang out quickly from under the table. She had entirely forgotten the bread. She acted as do children who are always terrified. She lied. "Madame, the baker was closed." "You ought to have knocked." "I did knock, madame." "Well?" "He didn't open." "I'll find out tomorrow if that is true," said Mrs. Thénardier, "and if you are lying, you will lead a pretty dance. Meantime, give me back the 15-sou piece." Cosette plunged her hand into her apron pocket and turned white. The 15-sou piece was not there. "Come," said the woman, "didn't you hear me?" Cosette turned her pocket inside out. There was nothing there. What could have become of that money? The little unfortunate could not utter a word. She was petrified. "Have you lost it, the 15-sou piece?" screamed the woman. "Or did you want to steal it from me?" At the same time, she reached her arm toward the cowhide whip hanging in the chimney corner. This menacing moment gave Cosette the strength to cry out, "Forgive me, madame, madame, I won't do so any more." The woman took down the whip. Meanwhile, the man in the yellow coat had been fumbling in his waistcoat pocket without being noticed. The other travelers were drinking or playing cards and paid no attention to anything. Cosette was writhing with anguish in the chimney corner, trying to gather up and hide her poor half-naked limbs. Mrs. Thénardier raised her arm. "I begged your pardon, madame," said the man, "but I just now saw something fall out of the pocket of that little girl's apron and roll away. That may be it." At the same time, he stooped down and appeared to search on the floor for an instant. "Just so. Here it is," he said, rising, and he handed a silver piece to the woman. "Yes, that is it," said she. That was not it, for it was a 20-piece sou piece, but Mrs. Thénardier found her profit in it. She put the piece in her pocket and contented herself with casting a ferocious look at the child and saying, "Don't let that happen ever again." Cosette went back to what Mrs. Thénardier called her hole, and her large eyes, fixed upon the unknown traveler, began to assume an expression that they had never known before. It was still only an artless astonishment, but a sort of blind confidence was associated with it. A door now opened, and Éponine and Elzama came in. They were really two pretty little girls, rather city girls than peasants, very charming, one with her well-polished auburn tresses, the other with her long black braids falling down on her back, and both so lively, neat, plump, fresh, and healthy that it was a pleasure to see them. They went and sat down by the fire. They had a doll which they turned backward and forward upon their knees with many pretty prattlings. From time to time, Cosette raised her eyes from her knitting and looked sadly at them as they were playing. Éponine and Elzama did not notice Cosette. To them, she was like the dog. The doll of the Thénardier sisters was very much faded and very old and broken, but appeared none the less wonderful to Cosette, who had never in her life had a doll, a real doll. Cosette left her knitting, but she had not moved from her place. Cosette always stirred as little as possible. She had taken from a little box behind her a few old rags and her little lead sword. Éponine and Elzama paid no attention to what was going on. They had just performed a very important operation. They had caught the kitten. They had thrown the doll on the floor. While Éponine and Elzama were dressing up the cat, Cosette, for her part, had dressed up the sword. That done, she laid it upon her arm and was singing it softly to sleep. All at once, Cosette stopped. She had just turned and seen the little Thénardier's doll, which they had forsaken for the cat and left on the floor a few steps from the kitchen table. Then she let the bundled-up sword, which only sat, half satisfied her, fall, and ran her eye slowly around the room. Mrs. Thénardier was whispering to her husband and counting some money. Éponine and Elzama were playing with the cat. The travelers were eating and drinking or singing. Nobody was looking at her. She had not a moment to lose. She crept out from under the table on her hands and knees and made sure once more that nobody was watching her, and then she darted quickly to the doll and seized her. An instant afterwards she was at her place, seated, motionless, only turned in such a way as to keep the doll that she held in her arms in the shadow. Nobody had seen her, except the traveler, who was slowly eating his meager supper. This joy lasted nearly a quarter of an hour. In spite of Cosette's precautions, she did not perceive that one of the doll's feet stuck out, and that the fire in the fireplace lighted it up vividly. This rosy and luminescent foot, which protruded from the shadow, suddenly caught Elzama's eye, and she said to Éponine, "Oh, sister!" The two little girls stopped, stupefied. Cosette had dared to take the doll. Éponine got up, and, without letting go of the cat, went to her mother and began to pull at her skirt. "Let me alone," said the mother. "What do you want?" "Mother," said the child, "look there," and she pointed at Cosette. Cosette, wholly absorbed in the ecstasy of her possession, saw and heard nothing else. "Cosette!" Cosette shuddered as if the earth had quaked beneath her. She turned around. "Cosette!" repeated Mrs. Thénardier. Cosette took the doll and placed it gently on the floor. With a kind of veneration mingled with despair, she sobbed. Meanwhile, the traveler arose. "What is the matter?" he asked. "Don't you see?" answered the woman. "Well, what is that?" "That beggar has dared to touch the children's doll." "Well?" What if she did play with that doll? She's touched it with her dirty hands, continued Mrs. Thénardier, with her horrid hands. Here Cosette redoubled her sobs. Be still, cried the woman. The man walked straight to the street door, opened it, and went out. As soon as he was gone, Mrs. Thénardier profited by his absence to give Cosette under the table a severe kick, which made the child shriek. The door opened again, and the man reappeared, holding in his hands the fabulous doll of which we had spoken, and which had been the admiration of all the youngsters in the village since morning. And he stood it up before Cosette, saying, Here, this is for you. Cosette raised her eyes. She saw the man approach her with the doll, as she would have seen the sun approach. She heard those astounding words, This is for you. She looked at him. She looked at the doll. And then she drew back slowly and went and hid as far as she could under the table in the corner of the room. She wept no more. She cried no more. She had the appearance of no longer daring to breathe. Mrs. Thénardier, Éponine, and Elzama were so many statues. Even the drinkers stopped. There was a solemn silence in the whole room. Cosette looked upon the wonderful doll with a sort of terror. It seemed to her that if she touched that doll, thunder would spring forth from it, which was true to some extent, for she thought Mrs. Thénardier would scold her and beat her. However, the attraction overcame her. She finally approached and timidly murmured, turning toward Mrs. Thénardier, Can I, madam? Good Lord, said the woman. It is yours, since Monsieur gives it to you. Is it true? Is it true, Monsieur? Cosette asked. Is the lady for me? The stranger appeared to have his eyes full of tears. He nodded assent to Cosette and put the hand of the lady in her little hand. I will call her Catherine, she said. It was Éponine and Azelma now who looked upon Cosette with envy. Cosette went to bed, holding Catherine in her arms. Several hours passed away. The midnight mass was said, and the revel was finished. The drinkers had gone, the house was closed, the room was deserted, the fire had gone out, and the stranger still remained in the same place and in the same posture. The innkeeper retired to his room. His wife was in bed, but not asleep. When she heard her husband's step, she turned toward him and said, You know that I'm going to kick Cosette outdoors tomorrow. For his part, the traveler had put his staff and bundle in a corner. The host had gone. He sat down in an armchair, and there he remained for some time, thinking. Then he drew off his shoes and went out of the room, looking about him as though he were searching for something. He passed through the hall and came to the stairway. There he heard a very soft little sound, which resembled the breathing of a child. There, among all sorts of old baskets and old rubbish, in the dust and among the cobwebs, there was a bed, if a mattress so full of holes as to show the straw, and a covering so full of holes as to show the mattress, can be called a bed. There were no sheets. This was placed on the floor immediately on the tiles. In this bed, Cosette was sleeping. The man approached and looked at her. Cosette was sleeping soundly. She was dressed. In the winter, she did not undress on account of the cold. She held the doll clasped in her arms. On the following morning, at least 2 hours before the day, Thénardier sat at a table in the bar-room, a candle by his side, with a pen in hand, was making out the bill of the traveler in the yellow coat. His wife was standing, half bent over him, following her with her eyes. You don't forget that I kicked Cosette out of the house today, the monster. It tears me apart to see her with the doll. Thénardier lighted his pipe and answered between two puffs. You'll give the bill to the man. And then he went out. He was scarcely out of the room when the traveler came in. Mrs. Thénardier handed him the folded bill. The man unfolded the paper and looked at it, but his thoughts were evidently elsewhere. Madame, he replied, do you do a good business in Montfermeil? So, monsieur, answered Mrs. Thénardier, stupefied at seeing no other explosion. She continued in a mournful and lamenting train, Oh, monsieur, times are very hard, and then we have so few rich people around here. It is a very little place, you see. If only we had rich travelers now and then, like monsieur. We have so many expenses. Why, that little girl eats us out of house and home. What little girl? Why, the little girl you know, Cosette. Suppose you were relieved of her. Who? Cosette? Yes. Ah, monsieur, my good monsieur, take her, keep her, take her away, carry her off, sugar her, stuff her, drink her, eat her, and be blessed by the Holy Virgin and all the saints in paradise. Agreed. Really? You will take her away? I will. Immediately? Immediately. Call the child. In the meantime, continued the man, I will pay my bill. How much is it? He cast a glance at the bill and could not repress a moment of surprise. 23 francs. He looked at the hostess and repeated, 23 francs? Mrs. Thénardier had time to prepare herself for the shock. She replied with assurance, Yes, of course, monsieur, it is 23 francs. The stranger, placed five franc pieces upon the table. Go for the little girl, he said. At this moment, Thénardier advanced in the middle of the room and said, Monsieur owes 26 sous. 26 sous, exclaimed the woman. 20 sous for the room, continued Thénardier coldly, and 6 for supper. As to the little girl, I must have some talk with monsieur about that. Leave us, wife. Thénardier continued, How strangely we become attached. What is all this silver? Take back your money. This child I adore. Who is that? Asked the stranger. Oh, our little Cosette. Pardon me, excuse me, monsieur, but one does not give his name like that to a traveler. I do not even know your name. I must, at least, see some poor rag of paper, a bit of passport, something. The stranger, without removing him from this gaze which went, so to speak, to the bottom of his conscience, added in a severe and firm tone, Monsieur Thénardier, people do not take a passport to come 5 leagues from Paris. If I take Cosette, I take her. That is all. You will not know my name. You will not know my abode. You will not know where she goes. And my intention is that she shall never see you again in her life. Do you agree to that, yes or no? Monsieur, he said, I must have 1,500 francs. The stranger took from his side pocket an old black leather pocketbook, opened it, and drew forth 3 bank bills, which he placed upon the table. Then he rested his large thumb on those bills and said to the tavern keeper, Bring Cosette. The day was breaking when those of the inhabitants of Montfermeil, who were beginning to open their doors, saw pass on the road to Paris a poorly clad good man leading a little girl dressed in mourning, who had a pink doll in her arms. It was the stranger and Cosette. Cosette walked seriously along, opening her large eyes and looking at the sky. From time to time, she looked at the good man. She felt somewhat as if she were near God. By Victor Hugo.